You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
All right, hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. This week we are going to be discussing goth music, but more interestingly, we're going to be talking about those sites of kind of liminality and debate and ambiguity where what we've come to know as goth music collides with and makes sweet, sweet love to pop and indie music. And we're going to kind of talk about what effect that's had on the culture and on goth clubs and kind of through the 80s until now. So as always, I am the Count, and I'm here with my co-host, Mark. Hello.
Hello.
Mark. And our special guest this month is a local scene queen. Is that offensive? Wonderful, well-known scene figure, Joshua. Joshua, thanks for coming on today.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
So what I like to do at the beginning, just for to kind of give some depth to and backstory to the guests we have on, is if you don't mind telling us a little about what your first introduction to the goth scene or the alternative scene was, a bit about what kind of drew you in and why it's kept you in it till today, and then feel free to promote your where people can find your music and anything else online.
Yeah, for sure. I would say I got into goth in junior high. I want to say I was probably around 13. It was a combination of a lot of different things. I grew up basically exclusively listening to like movie and anime soundtracks, and especially 80s one-hit wonders. I'm not sure why I was so gravitated towards that, but from there there was a for like a year in Chicago there was a 80s radio station that exclusively played 80s music. I basically had it on whenever I was listening to the radio. I would listen to that for an hour, and then I would switch over to Coast AM with Art Bell, which yes. Probably explains a lot as well. But so for the hour before our Coast to Coast AM came on, there was a alternative like 80s program for like an hour, and I got into a lot of music through that. It was also a combination of like hearing Close to Me on that like alt 80s radio program and seeing the video for Close to Me by The Cure on pop-up video of all things. Like I just remember like being in my room, I forget what I was doing, and then like I just had VH1 on in the background, and the melody just really caught me. I ended up buying I think the CD version of the first Greatest Hits compilation was staring at the CD. I bought that at Record Breakers, I want to say, in the suburbs. And I basically, after like I loved it, it was like one of the first CDs I bought. And then at the same time, I also bought Get Ready by New Order and Beautiful Garbage by Garbage, like probably like not too far after that, because I basically started exploring bands that allmusic.com told me sounded like The Cure. Right. And I was lucky that I had like my brother and sister were away from college, and my dad really didn't listen to his CD collection. So my dad had like the most bizarre music taste. Like he he listened to a lot of just like rock, like virtuoso rock. Like my middle name's Eric after Eric Clapton.
Oh,
and
wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
But then like he was like a big Peter Murphy fan, and like he had I stole like In the Flat Field from him, and my sister had a few like Cure CDs. My brother had like Ministry, like early Ministry. He didn't like he didn't like the synthpop stuff, so I was able to pilfer that from him. He eventually did steal Land of Rape and Honey back from me once when I was visiting him in San Diego a couple years later. But yeah, so basically it just went from like kind of getting into 80s, like the popular 80s goth. At the same time, I kind of got into like those New Order, like that New Order and that Garbage album, like were really big for me at the time too. And a lot of my music taste I just ravenously researched music at that time in my life. And I guess what's kept me with it has really been the music more than anything. You know, I think maybe some of the genre trappings have changed in terms of what I prefer to listen to. But I would say it's really the music and the people in the scene, like my friends. Yeah. I feel like even if the friendship isn't always focused on the music per se, just having some of the music in common or just having the culture in common has really allowed me to meet a lot of wonderful people in Chicago.
Yeah. So suck it, internet.
Basically. Yeah.
I just got into an argument yesterday, the day before. Someone was like, goth has nothing to do with music. It's just a Victorian philosophy subculture.
I have seen this debate going around on the YouTubes, so it seems like a pretty hot topic right now.
Well, but speaking of music, then where can we? And I'll link to it in the show notes if anybody wants to check you out.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder. So I make music under the name Gewattertat, which is German for Godfather Death. My music is not nearly as metal as that would make it sound. I'm kind of debating changing my musical moniker, but I'm also kind of endeared to it at this point. I've had it for like a year and a half. I would say my music's kind of somewhere in between like cheesy synth pop and kind of current like synth indie goth like Trust and Austra and that sort of thing. Kind of has influences from both. Also kind of have some dream poppy, shoegazy, post-punk tracks I'm working on. I have like 40 demos. I'm trying to finish an album right now. It's all over the place. So I'm just going to see what happens. But people can find my music. Basically, I think it's just... I don't actually know. This is bad. I should know the SoundCloud link off the top of my head. But if you just Google GEVATTER space TOD, it comes from a Grimm's Brother fairy tale, and then either like Chicago or Bandcamp and SoundCloud, or on Facebook. It's pretty easy to find the 2 EPs I've released so far.
Yep, and I will. I'll have direct links if you're listening on your phone. You just swipe either left or right. It'll have the show notes, and you can click the link in there, and it'll take you right to the band page. All right, cool. So yeah, like I said, we're going to be talking about music, you know, at least in relation, first of all, to today. If we're looking at the recent history of goth music, it seems to me that around 2012 we started seeing a resurgence of post-punk music in sort of the lineage of the UK sounds of the 80s. Different to what we saw in 2005, 2004 with the deathrock revival. And I think I was trying to figure out the timeline here. I think a couple years after that, we started seeing more cold wave bands, and then I started noticing a lot of death rock bands showing up about a year after that. And then now, I think the last year, 2017, was pretty strong overall, and there was a good mix of goth and goth-related genres. What we're going to be talking about, though, is that somewhere in those last few years, it seems like we've seen a resurgence of more pop and indie-oriented bands incorporating these darker elements that we've been seeing with, if you want to call it a post-punk revival or whatever, it doesn't matter to me. But and I was thinking about this, if we make a comparison to the kind of appropriations of the 2000s, which I'm more familiar with, when we saw the kind of metal and alt-rock bands hit their peak in the mainstream with like Evanescence, Nightwish, Avril Lavigne was really big at Hot Topic for a while. There were some emo bands that were taking on a kind of darker scene.
Or all those like symphonic metal bands like over in Europe.
Yep.
Sorry, I shouldn't interrupt.
Yeah, no, go ahead. No,
I was going to say, I feel like those don't get conflated with goth now the way that they did at the time either, which is really fascinating. I actually haven't given that too much thought.
Yeah, and that's where I'm heading. I think so. Then, I think there was a kind of a darker electronic, like techno scene around 2010. That might be a little late. It might have been earlier than that, but what I see now, though, because that's kind of the more recent comparison, is that we have this different cultural and musical milieu that's not it's reflecting on the past, whereas in the 2000s I think that music was more about looking to the future and modernization, and it also has more of a cult-like popularity with the bands that we're seeing today, and then I also think that we're seeing something a bit more interesting as well, kind of along those lines, especially when you get to the hard to classify acts that I'm sure we're going to talk about. So like Chelsea Wolfe, King Dude, Zola Jesus, Them Are Us Too, Cult of Youth, Savages, Austra, and there's a ton. I've been trying to research these bands because I'm not really familiar with them, but so I guess we can, I don't know if you guys also agree that's kind of an accurate assessment, but I want to start talking about the how you think the era of goth music, how this era of goth music places within the last 40 years, as far as, do you think this is more of a reflection of the early 80s kind of melting pot of goth synth pop?
That was an
melting pop.
It's gonna lead into kind of the point I was gonna make.
I've seen, and then the other two were like, I actually saw an article calling these new bands like art goth, as something that's totally new because everything has to be new and unique. Or is it just, are we saying maybe kind of more of a postmodern thing where these bands are trying to just completely eschew genre classification in general, like punk tried to do and failed, and try to be their own thing?
So I was kind of thinking, in order to kind of trace back where we are now, it would be interesting to kind of look at goth music in relation to popular and independent music in the 80s. I think people do try and make a pretty big distinction right now between kind of the more indie, or for lack of a better word, maybe hipster-oriented bands. I don't view that as a bad term myself. I know that might be a dangerous thing to say here, but for lack of a better word, because I would agree there isn't really an overall really genre term for a lot of these bands. I would say, predominantly I see a lot of like minimal synth and cold wave influence, like indie bands. But I think if you look back to the 80s itself, it is kind of glamorized as goth music is glamorized as this entity completely separate from pop and indie music, when a lot of it was, in my opinion, just pop and indie music. I think when you look at a lot of the early goth bands, one of the biggest influences was like Roxy Music, which I think if you look at, it was glam rock, but it was also pretty pop. I think, now we would probably consider a lot of David Bowie pop. I mean, look at how many shows in the last like 3 years have done covers of Life on Mars, you know, in popular culture. Of course, and then there's...
But not Peter Murphy, because...
No.
We just found out he thinks that Bowie is a twit, so...
I was actually having a conversation the other day with my Uber driver. He was playing... what was he playing? Oh, yeah, Psychedelic Furs. And
nice.
I was just, saying, it's cool that you're playing that. And we just kind of got into a conversation about music on the radio in the 80s. And we were talking about how... I was talking about how Tears for Fears just played a show of Hall & Oates. And he was saying how, in his mind, that would have been unthinkable in the 80s, which kind of led to us talking about New Order. And he was saying he never heard New Order in America on the radio. Maybe he just wasn't listening to the right stations. And then I did bring up college radio, which he was like, sure. I think maybe just the methods of distribution were different then.
Well, they played it at Medusa's, or at least the one in Chicago.
That's very true.
The old one, yeah.
I mean, there's, of course, and that's definitely how music got proliferated was through clubs and college radio zines. Just going to the record store and seeing what they had at the time. It wasn't as easy as it is now, but I think that separation makes it really easy to romanticize. And I'm not talking about like hardcore post-punk, acts, or some of the more obscure like early 90s, late 80s like deathrock acts, but more even just like the like The Cure and Susie and the Banshees. They had, especially The Cure, even more so, had pretty big popular music hits, especially in the UK. Obviously, they did here with Friday I'm in Love. But I just really feel like we, in our minds, maybe don't recognize just how much relation there was with acts even like Specimen, like with pop music. I think everyone was hanging out with Mark Almond and like Soft Cell. I just feel like the separation isn't there the way it is in a lot of people's minds. In terms of just, at least in terms of like the well-known, like gothy goth acts, in my mind at least.
Well, I think, there's kind of a relation still. I mean, if you want to tie that into modern music, I kind of think that like a lot of this dark electronic music it might be kind of a response to the overall upsurge in dance pop that's, kind of all over mainstream radio right now.
I feel like it's more of a reaction to kind of like the post-punk revival. I know Dan earlier had said 2012, but I would say I got into like post-punk and dance punk in like 2004. I feel like in my mind there were bands I think along those lines I liked before them, but I feel like Interpol was a really big influence in introducing a lot of people to both Joy Division and post-punk in general. I remember my brother playing them for me, asking me who they reminded me of, expecting me to immediately say Joy Division, and I immediately said Psychedelic Furs, not to bring them up again. Instead,
they're another band who were kind of debated as far as like how the goth canon, like were they goth, what were they? They kind of were all over the place, kind of. I think
there's a lot of acts like that. I mean, just look at The Cure. For every gothier Cure album, there's one that's basically just either pop or just like art rock, left field experimentation. So
and I made a note of this at the very end of what I had here actually, but I guess I might as well bring it up now. You guys can tell me what you think. I was reading a few research papers, and one of them was talking about how because the canon of goth music and the canonization of goth music was still debated today, unlike what we have with punk music, where it's like we know what the sounds are, we know what to expect, this is sort of the template, because that's still, even the stuff from the 80s is still changes, it still gets moved around, that's what keeps goth alive. I guess it's on the assumption that goth is a music subculture or culture that I guess people would debate that. But
I feel like we all probably agree with that.
Yeah, at least
that
here,
though.
Yeah.
Only the three of us.
Yeah.
I would agree with that for sure. And that's kind of something I was gonna touch base with. I feel like if you move to the 90s and kind of look at how goth music was iterated on in that decade.
Well, let me talk about the 80s first.
I thought you were moving. Okay.
No, not quite yet. I did a little bit of research. I feel like the 80s is the one thing I can talk about with a little bit of confidence as far as compared to like today, because a lot of these bands that are in between kind of are lost on me. But yeah, as far as the first thing I did was look at like what was charting, like what was getting mainstream popularity. If you want to talk about the pop stuff, so you had Sisters of Mercy made the UK top 10 twice and the top 40s 5 times. Susie and the Banshees charted in the top 10 twice with 18 singles in the top 40. Those were the two I looked up, but then you also had bands like The Damned and The Mission. You mentioned The Cure. All those bands were also making the charts pretty often. So you've got that kind of mixing going on with a mainstream audience hearing what we would consider today to be underground music. If you look at like the interviews and with the original goth bands, the main 5 or 6 that people reference, they always the same kind of influences for those bands pop up. So you've got like the Velvet Underground, David Bowie, Roxy Music, as you mentioned, T-Rex also comes up a lot, Lou Reed, Brian Eno, and another big influence was for post-punk was The Idiot by Iggy Pop, which was something that he worked on with David Bowie. Night Clubbing was a song off that album that Susie even covered. And even before that, you have like influences from artists like Screamin' Jay Hawkins, which was Alice Cooper came after him. It was more the shock rock thing, but it still made an impact. And that was, Alice Cooper and Bowie, and those were all pop artists, or at least gained popular influence.
Sure.
And
I would
then
even say like Billie Holiday, even if you look at how many goth musicians have covered Strange Fruit. I feel like it's definitely, if you look at the influence, it's interesting how to get to where we are now. like the filter, you start with kind of this funnel of glam rock, and even going farther to blues, and then it kind of funnels out to people who are influenced by the bands who are influenced by them, and just kind of how that has, really spread. I think it's important to kind of look at that in terms of context, and even just like giving credit to blues musicians who really invented rock.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. And I think part of the interesting thing with, if we're talking about, I think you mentioned that people today want to kind of ignore how much of an influence or how much mainstream popularity goth bands back then had, and and what kind of sounds they were using.
I wanted to interject with that. You
sure.
had mentioned Sisters of Mercy earlier. I would hope a lot of people at this point, as accessible Wikipedia is, would know this, but I not off the I don't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, but they shared a producer on quite a few songs with both Celine Dion and Meatloaf.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I did know that. Yeah. That happened a lot too, and I think people. What I see a lot happening in the goth scene is people want to dismiss pop music, just kind of out of hand based on how popular it is, and they a lot of times you'll hear goths say that goth music is much more intellectual and it's much more unique, and it's got but I think what ends up happening is we miss out on the really innovative artists, because this is something I was going to argue later, but I think the real innovation happens with the like Drab Majesties and the Them Or Us too, where you've got, you can still kind of classify the genre with adjectives and things like that and pick out what they're drawing from, but you can end up in the goth scene, I think, too much relying on one specific sound and missing out on a lot of other things, which maybe that's, I don't know, maybe that's two different topics. Like what one is, it would be like, how do we decide what goth music is, but then the other one is
I would say, how does it make you feel? The old psychologist question. I mean, if it gives you the same feeling that the more accepted subgenres in the scene do, then I think that could be an accurate
for what goth music is.
Yeah.
Well, I would say personally, and I don't know if this is getting too far ahead, current crop of kind of, I would say more than any other term, I just use maybe like modern dark wave. I used to get pretty up in arms about a specific use of, especially the term dark wave, because I felt like it got thrown around. But then I think too often I associated dark wave really with like mid 90s to mid 2000s, just like American goth bands, I guess, like Bella Morte, especially early Bella Morte, and that crop of kind of just like synthy goth bands that really embraced me in goth, I guess. Whereas now I feel like more than anything, it's that genre doesn't really exist as much anymore. The bands that were in that genre,
well, yeah, it's kind of, I think because it was in the 80s, you had the goth, what we call goth bands now, most of them were saying, we don't want to be goth, we want to do our own thing.
While they were going to the Bat Club.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Bat Cave, I'm sorry.
Yeah. And then when you had the 90s roll around, I think the sentiment from those bands largely was the stuff from the 80s was great, but it wasn't dark enough, and we are going to specifically be goth, and this is what we're going to... And so now I think you also have, again, another reference to the 80s is we don't necessarily want to be labeled as goth, we want to, which is, I mean, everything's going to be labeled as a genre.
I don't think the current crop are maybe as adverse to the label. It just, honestly, okay. You would be surprised it just doesn't get brought up. Like the Cloak and Dagger festival that just happened in California, I was kind of surprised that there were as many kind of just non-goth, I don't want to say non-goth identifying bands, because a lot of them, do play goth events,
Yeah.
but maybe wouldn't go out of their way to call themselves goth to play like a really genre-specific festival, which, I maybe now have a different impression. I wasn't super familiar with Cloak and Dagger before the Chicago chapter opened up.
Yeah.
Might have but it was a good lineup, though, for the festival. You know,
it was. It
a great
definitely
lineup.
was. And that's what put them on the map, too, because we're going all over the place.
Sorry. There's just so
like,
much to talk. This is a hard subject to hone in on, because there's so much you can go for. So maybe we can after talking about Cloak and Dagger, we can circle back to the 80s.
I mean, before that festival happened, all my friends maybe not all, most
maybe
of my friends
in Chicago at least, you know.
Well, in LA, they were telling me like Cloak and Dagger is a poser club, and they play hip hop and like other garbage music, and only the people that go there aren't actually goth. They just get Instagram models to post photos online. And
that's what it seems. Oh man,
So,
I'll say it. I have so many issues with it. I'm just so anti-elitism in the scene. I feel like that's just like a death knell. So that definitely seems like what the Chicago one is, but I haven't gone. I'm not interested in going. I would love to hear other people's opinions.
Yeah, see, and I was thinking about that, and like because I'm not necessarily opposed to membership cards, but I think because Seattle has a pretty successful club where you have to be a member, but members basically the rule is you are a member, and then you can bring a guest. If you bring a guest 3 times, they become a member, and then they can get in. Which is kind of
can
be useful to keep it as a
personally.
safe place.
I still would agree that I also
Okay.
think it's bullshit, but that's at least seems a little more organic than what is happening with the Chicago chapter. Again, I don't want to get too off base. It's just I can summarize what I would have said for probably a full hour just with I am not into elitism, objectification, or racism. So it just kind of touches on, I think maybe even unintentionally, some trigger points that I'm just not into. And you know what? I think what would be cool is maybe a female or femme identifying focus venue that just was really focused on making everyone feel safe. I think that I would be into, and that was what I was kind of hoping it was at first, and I just from what I've seen, I just don't think that's what it is. But I think circling back to the 80s, would you say that there is currently, because I feel like you're more on the pulse in terms of internet goth culture than maybe I am. Like there is still a big, I feel like just on the periphery I have seen insinuations that maybe this current crop of just independent dark wave or darker synth bands, there is a big distinction between that and goth, as well as a big jump between the musical choices of a lot of trad goths. And it's strange because what's happening now is kind of disjointed too. Just like we're having a hard time coming up with a genre classification for it, because in my opinion, it's kind of close to what was happening in the 80s in terms of just a lot of people experimenting with sound instead of trying to adhere to a specific sound. I think there's a lot of similar influences throughout all of the bands, but like I wouldn't say that Trust sounds like them RS2, and them RS2 doesn't sound like Cold Cave, I feel like whereas I honestly feel like a lot of bands that were coming up in the mid 90s and early 2000s sounded alike. There was a lot of especially similar male vocals. I feel like there was a very specific like 90s 2000s male dark wave voice that was just in every single goth band or synthpop band or any genre adjacent band. It was kind of exhausting after a while. I like that music too. I think that's something else I want to put out there when I'm talking about all of this. I'm coming from a perspective where I basically listened to everything for a very long time in terms of any genre you can think of. I'm almost like I like all music of goth, because I can even say I had like psychobilly horror pops phase for like a week in high school. So I'm not above anything either, and I've listened to a lot of I feel like 2000s synth goth that did not age well, but I still have very fond memories of.
No, same. And it's you're right, it's kind of like you can only listen to so many bands that sound like Elvis for so long before you get fatigue on it, right? It's like,
well, here I would say you're familiar with Drab Majesty, right?
Yes, yeah.
Would you say something like Drab Majesty is going to age better than like Helium Vola or like some of the other goth stalwarts that like, or like just any? I'm blanking at like a great example, but like. A lot of the things I want to say are almost synthpop because there is just so much crossover with every genre in terms of what gets played regularly and what still gets played.
Right. I think they will, because I think with Drab Majesty specifically, I think they embody that kind of the kind of ghost of the past that's kind of a theme throughout really successful goth music, where they're like a lot of goth music draws on gothic literature themes like anxiety and dread and decadence and the uncanny and claustrophobia and like these atmospheric things, and I think they do that really well.
I think, all the words you just used describe his music perfectly. I'm actually very impressed because I feel like those are all adjectives he would love, or Deb would love.
Yeah.
And I feel like Drab Majesty is interesting because a lot of the current bands really are image adverse, and
they have a definite image.
They definitely have an edge. They have an image, and they're not afraid to push that in relation to the music. I was actually kind of surprised when I last saw Drab Majesty live. A lot of my goth friends were just kind of snickering at the image while also enjoying it, like the makeup and the look. But I think it's great. I feel like there is an anti-focus almost on image right now, is like a reaction. It's like everything's really cyclical, and whenever there are a lot of bands that are focusing on their image or just have a very strong image, there's always a reactionary period after where bands are just focused either on the music or cultivating a more relaxed look.
Well, but I mean, both of those are very goth. I think is you have on the one end you have like Sisters of Mercy in the 80s was all about being very serious about their image, and then you have where Drab Majesty I think would fit in is with the Batcave, where it's schlocky, it's sarcastic, it's funny, it's this kind of wink and a smile, like ridiculous, but we're not taking ourselves too seriously, but it's still meaningful kind of thing. And I think that kind of fits in with that. But yeah. Go. Do you want to say something?
No, it's just I had a feeling this was going to happen because I feel like we can both talk about these concepts in a really broad sense, whereas kind of keeping on track requires honing in on certain things where it's kind of hard to talk specifics when we both probably are going to want to talk like overarching themes.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. So that came off of the what did I say?
I asked you earlier. How about we get back to this? I asked you earlier if you feel like there is still a distinction within like the internet goth community between these acts and trad goth acts.
Oh yeah, I think there is. So. If we're talking about like current canon, I keep using that word, but there's specific genres that you could call goth. I think universally online. And then the other bands like we were talking about, which are, although I think, like I was saying with Mark on a different show, that Drab Majesty is right on the razor's edge of that, where I think you've got kind of an even split where like, yeah, of course this is totally goth, and other people are like, well, it's a little bit outside of what it is.
Well, I'm wondering, and we're both from Chicago. I feel like the culture here is really accepting of new music, and I'm possibly in a bubble when it comes to perceptions of this music, because Chicago, for the most part, is really accepting when it comes to even in the goth community. It wasn't always like this. It's a recent thing. But because I'm always shocked when I look at kind of the playlists that get posted from the local goth nights, where the first time I saw that like Trust was getting requested on a regular basis really blew my mind, because it was just something I wouldn't have expected. It did seem not different for me. I would request Trust on goth nights, but just to see that the community has embraced that music was awesome, And I feel like that's what's going to keep the scene current, and it's going to kind of drive away stagnation. So I'm wondering if maybe my perception is colored just from kind of more so focusing in on the people in our scene who are more musically inclined, in terms of accepting the music of like newer music. But
Right.
I just honestly, I whenever like this stuff gets played out in the clubs here, everyone still dances, everyone gets really into it, and
Yeah.
I feel like maybe a lot of the goths who identify maybe not as a hipster or as just really identify as just goth, like they hear the music out and they like it and they get into it just through either hearing it out or hearing like their friends like it, and it's kind of organic in that sense. It's not being pushed as goth, it's being played at musical nights that play darker music and people just like it. I mean, that's my impression. And
It also depends on how much people have been drinking. If they're really drunk, they're gonna dance.
Well, Mark, what about the club you go to? I know they mostly play post-punk, right? So, but are they?
Yeah.
Are they accepting of new music like that, or is
But
it
what kind of post-punk?
Yeah,
are we talking about, like, hipster post-punk? I don't want to keep using the word hipster because I feel like that's really inflammatory, but...
I mean, they play old and new stuff. Like, they'll play, obviously your, Sisters and Joy Division and all that, but they'll also play Cold Cave, they'll play Drab Majesty, a lot of that newer stuff. I wish they would play, like, more cold wave, more electronic stuff. They do sometimes.
Well, when you say cold wave, because that's another term that gets thrown around in a couple different ways. Are you talking about like French cold wave or American cold wave?
Well, any cold wave. There seems to be an overemphasis on like guitar oriented music, I think.
Sure.
And I'd like to hear a little bit more of that because aesthetically, I think it would stay true to the vibe you're trying to put out. But it's good to vary things up a bit.
So yeah, to get back on track, I do think to kind of give us some structure, it would be helpful to maybe kind of keep to the decade thing. Are you ready to move to the 90s, or do you feel like there was anything from the... And I'm sorry, I talk a lot, so please shut me up if you need to.
I'm okay with that. I did... we were kind of talking about the state of the scene, which I wanted to stay on for a little bit.
Sure.
Since we were already there. I think you're right. I think you asked about specifically outside of Chicago. I do hear from scenes like in Texas, a couple DJs that are on my other DJ podcast, and from LA, I do hear people complaining about hearing the same things. And even still, like I don't get the complaint of like every time I go to the club, I hear "Call the Ships to Port" and military fashion show.
See, I don't hear that at all.
That is fascinating to me because I DJ a queer goth night here in Chicago, goth disco. We kind of play everything. We'll play like I know a lot of people who like the same overlaps in music, so we'll play just as much as Italo as we will like EBM. And it always happens for some reason when I'm not the one in the DJ booth, we'll get a request for like Covenant or like something that like one of the other DJs might not be as familiar with. Just because I am much older than my co-DJs by like 5 years. And then they're always like, I guess, okay, we'll play it. And then like, I'll like come in the booth and I'll see the requests and I'll like help queue it up. And or they'll find it late. We DJ at Late Bar here in Chicago, and they have a really great catalog of just like a big music library for the DJs to pull off of if they need to. But, that stuff works just as well in the context of some of the other artists we've mentioned earlier. Again, I have been told by other people, though, that Chicago in general at the moment is just more accepting of newer music than some other cities. Yeah. And I wonder if that's just because the promoters here push newer music harder than they do in other cities. I've been to goth nights in, like, Detroit, but I haven't really been to too many nights outside of Illinois. So I can't really comment on that.
Well, I would say other than Chicago, I think the most friends I have are in New York, and that scene is definitely I think similar with playing a lot of not just genres outside, but new bands within the same genres. And
New York is such a hotbed for music in general. I feel like a lot of the artists we've mentioned just in general would do well regardless of support from the specific goth scene or not. So
I think so. Yeah, and then with the going back to those two DJs from Texas, they actually on one of their episodes they were talking about how because they talk about the industrial scene, that's their thing, and they complain a lot about how they always played the same music. But a recent discussion they had that I thought was interesting was about how like synthwave, and I think they called it witch wave.
That's a new
Did
one.
they say Witch House?
I've heard
No,
Witch House.
I think
but
they
not
said witch wave. Yeah. They said that was starting to get play in the clubs there, and they were hoping that would take the industrial scene to a different place because it had gotten too stale. And the bands they mentioned were, I wrote it down because I'd never heard of them before, Salem and
That's Witch House.
Sidewalks and Skeletons.
Well, yeah, it's funny because they actually, Sidewalks and Skeletons actually just got announced a show in Chicago. It seems like there's a little bit of a Witch House revival going on right now, which is fascinating to me.
I thought it was
that
gone.
started off as like a Pitchfork, like total like hipster, there used to be like a jokey hipster blog, like Hipster Runoff would always like kind of like riff on those acts, and it's really fascinating for me to see kind of the community start to embrace that stuff more now. There was another just at Late Bar, I think in a couple weeks. I think it's January 31st. There's going to be a Witch House night at Late Bar playing those artists. I know.
Really?
I don't. Yeah, and there's also Black Dust in Chicago, which is a regular Witch House night here too.
Nice.
So there's definitely a kind of like a interest in that music, which is really fascinating to me because most of the artists who originated that genre, which was a complete joke, that term was a joke.
Yeah.
I like that music too. What's really interesting is I had happened off Salem. There was this might be a total tangent, but
no, that's fine. That's the theme of the show.
Yeah, please, and edit. I will not be offended if you have to edit anything I say out, because I know I'm talking a lot, because this is just a subject I can go on.
That's the less I have to talk, the better. To be honest.
So I got into Salem, who is the band I would attribute with originating the kind of template for Witch House. With
really,
for sure, yeah.
They were.
So
when was that? Because I thought
that
Witch
would
House
be
was
2000. That was when I was 18, because there was a gay dating website. It was like MySpace, but specifically for gay men, called D-List, which is hysterical. And you could upload it was a different time. You could just upload MP3s to your profile, and like no one gave a shit. And I ended up just happening across a friend of the band Salem's, like when they were just making demos. I think maybe they just released their first EP, and I was like, this sounds awesome. It was kind of just like ethereal, synthy dream pop. There was a lot of DIY, dreamy kind of like synth music around that time that I feel like it was right when GarageBand was getting bigger, and I think the means of production were kind of being distributed to people outside of music studios. That's really when you started seeing kind of like like blog pop and blog synth music. And yeah, so I really got into Salem, and I remember I actually had requested Salem at they had a Bruce Springsteen cover, but it was done really dark and like kind of dreamy, and I remember like requesting it at Nocturna and having to like explain what this music was to Scary Lady Sarah, and being like, this is a Bruce Springsteen cover, but it's kind of like ethereal goth. I don't know how else to describe it. With like trap, because what's interesting is Witch House isn't even house. It's like it's maybe like synthpop with like trap and juke influences, because Salem was basically influences by hip hop. Like juke music is like a type of like house influenced hip hop from Chicago, basically. And same with like trap is like the really hi-hat driven art, like hip hop and like rap, basically. And that was another big influence on like the bands that were just using like the trappings of R&B to make dark music. Like I would call that, especially like the bands at that time, I wouldn't be amiss to calling them like dark wave or goth. Even there was definitely a lot of overlap in terms of the kind of sound palette,
and it kind of varies from band to band
fist fight
too.
Later,
like,
that's fine.
Some lean more one way than another. Kind of depends on the band.
Like, do you know White Ring? Like White Ring was
I don't.
pretty goth, yeah. And but yeah,
so this was like 2006.
So this is, I would say, yeah, because I got into Salem and I would say 19, and that would have been 2007. So I would say Wish House kind of started in 2007. There was already kind of like a post-punk revival going on then. But I think even going back to the 90s, because I don't want to skip that because I have a lot I could say about it.
Let's go.
I would say that's, when The Cure and Susie were beginning to have their big, for real crossover pop hits. It's basically kind of in music history said that, The Cure had Friday I'm in Love, Susie had Kiss Them For Me, and then that progress in terms of kind of goth truly crossing over, especially in America. I can't speak as much for my perception of like top 40 pop music in the UK, because I just feel like in general for decades they were more accepting of left field acts than us. But in America, I'm not sure what Kiss Them For Me charted, but Friday I'm in Love I'm pretty sure was top 10 in the US.
Oh yeah. I heard it when I was working at McDonald's. It would come on every once in a while. So yeah.
It's been in so many romantic comedies too, which is hysterical to me. But that's another thing, really. I feel like in the 90s you start to see goth music appear in popular culture more in general. You have like Interview with the Vampire might not have had goth music, but it was definitely the novel was a goth stalwart in terms of modern gothic literature at the time. And I feel like there's a Swedish movie whose name I don't remember, that the entire soundtrack was Cure songs. I feel like you start to see,
was The Crow the 90s?
Yeah, The Crow was the 90s. Yeah, you have The Crow, you have a lot of I feel like when you think of the 80s, do you really think of any, maybe besides like The Hunger, can you think of any like movies that really are kind of show like a goth ideal? Like, because off the top, I'm sure there are maybe more than I'm thinking of, but off the top of my head, the only one I can really think of is like The Hunger. I feel like,
I think
if you were
most of them were vampire films. I can't
like
The
Lost Boys, maybe.
I know there's The Lost Boys.
The Lost Boys. No, The Lost Boys. I think is probably the only other one I would attribute to just being like a goth culture moment, maybe. But I feel like when you look at the 90s, you have maybe more of those. Maybe I'm just talking out of my ass here, but I feel like just in general,
Near Dark.
Oh, for sure, for sure. If Near Dark, and I'm sure there's others, but I feel like in
people
terms of
at
like
home are
real,
screaming
not
into
only
their...
goth. I feel like you can have goth culture moments, and then you can just kind of have pop culture moments in general.
Yeah,
and I feel like with Interview with the Vampire, you kind of had both. But to get back with what I was saying about kind of The Cure and Susie having crossover hits, that progress kind of got stilted by Nirvana and kind of grunge in general, and people not being as into pop. So I think it's interesting when you have probably two of the most well-known goth identified, even if not by themselves, acts. Their progress in terms of mainstream acceptance was, it was stopped by rock music. I think like if you look at like Nirvana versus like The Cure, like Smells Like Teenage Spirit versus Friday I'm in Love, like I'm not a huge Nirvana fan, but I would say Smells Like Teen Spirit goes harder, so is a darker song. So I think it's really funny when people kind of act like they're either above pop music, which you don't have to like anything. If you feel like something is too pop for you, awesome. Like there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But I think to keep your mind close to it, though, that's a different story. And I feel like there was a lot of crossover between pop and goth music, and then indie and goth music. If you look at like early REM, or even I know during the summer at the Pride Fest, it was either Pride Fest or Market Days, 10,000 Maniacs played. Their early stuff was post-punk. Like their first EP had I think it's My Mother the War, which is like a really Joy Division-esque sound. That's another one. Joy Division had a lot of crossover. I would probably consider Joy Division an indie band more than a goth band, obviously.
I do too, and I think I'm in the minority. I think I don't know. I think like if punks are angry that goths say they're a goth band, and goths are angry that punks say they're a punk band, but I don't see them as as goth, really. I don't think it fits.
I mean, Ian Curtis was fascinated by goth. I know he was like a big like Bauhaus fan, and I think he was kind of fascinated by these bands that had more of an image. And if Joy Division had any kind of image,
probably where it would have headed, I think, if they had stayed around.
Well, Mark, you're the resident Joy Division fan. What do you think? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. Of course, this was all happening at like the same time.
True,
so it wasn't like linear, one influencing another, because it was literally just, people kind of think that Joy Division was like the only band that served as an influence to these other ones, but the reality was they were all just popping up at the same time.
Yeah, and there was a lot of like band members playing for each other, either live or for albums, and then producers sharing producers and sharing like touring and you know, like helping each other. There's like way more collaboration between these artists than people might think happening, and that's where the kind of, I mean, everybody knows like, okay, so Robert Smith played with Susie and the Banshees, but there was a lot of that kind of thing happening.
Yeah.
You know, here's another point I'd love to make, though. You know how we were talking about the 80s goth bands being influenced by maybe glam rock, just to summarize. I feel like if you look at the artists that maybe like 90s goth musicians, and you know, when I say that, you can pull that into a lot of different genres. Synth pop, ethereal, ambient, dark wave in the 90s. I feel like you see a lot of influence from like Cocktail Twins and like Kate Bush, and like if you look at like Project Records, that was all ethereal, which was, I feel like, came out of like Cocktail Twins and like definitely. Kate Bush and that kind of like ethereal, but not ethereal or ambient identifying artists from like the 70s and 80s. Brian Eno, of course, too, and I feel like, again, they're being influenced by artists that weren't goth. And in my opinion, the music I'm still listening to from that time period wasn't the stuff that was going out of its way to be goth in terms of the overall package. I think there's a line, and I feel like when you're drawing influence from the kind of sources that, you know, the bigger bands did in the 80s, that's when you're coming up with something that's really special versus just trying to be dark, I guess, without really saying much, you know, like, honestly, I don't want to offend anyone, but like, if you love the Crew Shadows, awesome. I actually kind of had a nostalgia trip last year where I listened to a bunch of Crew Shadows, but I don't think that's going to age as well as Dread Majesty will, in terms of like the sound that they're aiming for, you know. I feel like Dread Majesty, I feel like you're right, like Dread Majesty is probably one of the, and it's been awesome to see too, like, and I remember when I first heard Dread Majesty, I saw the video for the Foyer, and that was on Vice. It was on Noisy. I clicked it because I thought he looked cool. When I'm not making music, that's when I'm listening to the most new music. Right now, I'm not quite as much of a new music fiend just because I'm just working on my own music, and that's kind of what's taking up my music listening time. But yeah, when I was first listening to Dread Majesty, I was fascinated because I was like, not only is this kind of going to appeal to some of my friends, it's going to appeal to the other side of my friends who like goth music and identify as goth. And it's just been really interesting to see like how many people I know who have gotten into Dread Majesty. I feel like Boy Harsher is another great example. They're one of my favorite bands. You know, they I was surprised when they were announced for Cold Waves, because I thought they were an act that was kind of going to try to stay away from the goth label, just based off of they weren't doing a lot of press for a while. They have done a lot of press now, which is awesome to get to kind of know the people behind the music better, but they also maybe ruined the mystique just a little bit because they didn't have a Facebook page until early last year, actually. I remember when I first got into them, they didn't have like a Facebook page, and they'd been active for a couple of years at that point. And they're another one where I'm surprised to see a lot of like they have a good crossover. You know, I go to like kind of alternative gay night at Berlin Nightclub in Chicago on Fridays. They play a lot of that's a great mix of music too. I think my friend Greg House DJs the Friday night every single Friday. I don't know if he's ever taken a Friday off and how long. He was like a Wax Trax boy in the 80s and goth, or I don't know if he identified as goth, but industrial boy probably.
Yeah.
And he'll play like Robin, and then not as much lately because I feel like just it's not as easy for gay bars these days due to gay dating applications. So I don't want to say that he panders, but maybe not as much as he did when I first turned 21. But like, it'll be like you'll hear Robin, and then like a couple songs later, it'll be like Skinny Puppy or 9 Inch Nails, like, or especially because Berlin has a really this is such a tangent, but Berlin has a really interesting history as a hub for queer goth culture. I've seen posters from Berlin having like Nina Hagen drag queen lookalikes. So you know what? Nina Hagen's another great example of somebody who gets conflated with goth, but it's just kind of left field experimental art rock for a long time. I don't know how else to describe her music. I've introduced some like younger friends to her, and they're just like blown away. But it doesn't sound like Sisters of Mercy. But I feel like I know just as many goths who love her. you know
there was a big debate about that when the I don't know if you saw the 40 Years of Goth, the first video that came out.
Yes
And she cited Nina Hagen as a inspiration for for the deathrock look specifically, and there was a big argument online about like, oh, Nina Hagen isn't even goth, like why would you put that as a deathrock thing? That's not. And then people were like, well, but she totally had an influence on what was happening at the time, and that was a huge debate happening online.
Yeah, I was joking to a friend not too long ago who wasn't familiar with Nina Hagen, that Nina Hagen basically invented makeup. So that was how I described Nina Hagen to my friend. Yeah. I said she escaped Eastern Germany before the wall. Or was it Western? I'm totally messing up my history. But she escaped bad Germany. Yeah. And my band name is German. That's horrible. Went to the other side, immediately became like the goddess mother of punk, and I guess maybe the gothic look, and invented makeup. So to kind of maybe circle back around to modern goth, I want to ask you, what do you think is healthier for the scene? Maybe bringing new blood in through this kind of music, or people maybe focusing on acts and just the culture of current and modern goth, I guess. Like, do you think it's important to identify as goth to keep the scene healthy? I'm not talking about maybe distinctions at this moment, just more in terms of keeping the scene active. Like, I know what I think, but I'm curious what you think.
Well, I was going to ask you that.
Sense.
That makes total sense. I think because I talked with William Faith and Sarah about this, and their opinion was that the death rock revival, the post-punk revival, was all old hat and just kind of rehashing stuff we had already heard, and the real innovation was happening with these kind of bands that we're talking about. Yeah. For me, I think there should be I think these bands should get more popular, because what you see with goths from the 80s is that they heard something akin to what we have today. These bands we're talking about on like Top of the Pops.
When you say more popular, though, you mean just within like the scene itself, right?
Yeah, the scene, and even broader than that. I don't think there's a problem with pop music, this specifically, like Drab Majesty, Them or Us Too, Youth Cult, those kinds of bands getting more.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Youth Cult in terms of the more like EBM industrial side. There's also a big, and I conflate both of these myself because there's a lot of crossover, but kind of like the new EBM thing that's going on. To me, I just kind of lump it all into the same thing. Like all my friends who like Drab Majesty, for the most part, like Youth Code.
Yeah.
Didn't they tour? They toured together, didn't they?
That's true. Yeah, they're friends.
Oh, are they really? I didn't know that.
They're on the same label. They're both on Deus Records.
Oh, okay.
And which is interesting. We're about to get Hyde, local Chicago industrial act, is about to release their first LP on Deus. So Deus is really, I feel like, on the pulse in terms of signing a lot of the bigger, them RS2 as well. for sure, like R.I.P.
Yeah.
Super sad. It was that had a big impact on me. But in terms of signing artists, I feel like who have a lot of crossover potential in a lot of different ways, because I feel like Youth Code is another great example of a band that appeals to a pretty wide audience.
Yeah, or like on the other, and that's more the industrial thing, and then on the other side with the indie and post-punk crossover you have with the same similar names is Cult of Youth.
Yeah, that was confusing for a while. I do that with a lot of bands that have similar names. That's happened with a lot of post-punk bands with similar names for me as well. I feel like there's like so many different bands with the name like Wolfe or Shadow.
Yeah, right.
Which is bad. I actually am friends with a few of the members of Shadow Age, and then there's also there's another band with the name Shadow in it, and it's gonna kill me. Another post-punk band.
Shadow Image?
No, it's they just played together too. Which
Mark, you know more music than me.
I'm trying to think. I don't.
We're all furiously Googling. Well, it doesn't matter.
Totally Googling right
now. But yeah, I think it's necessary. And see, like my question for you when it was about the scene turnout as far as concerts and stuff, because I think it's important.
Well, I'm always.
Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I'm so bad at interrupting.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
I think I know where you're going though, and I was gonna say I'm always fascinated when I go to the shows for the bands we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because I see a lot of almost even like trad goth looking people that I never see. Like there are a lot of trad goths who like and dig this music, but maybe don't participate in the scene, even if that's even their like image when they go out, you know? I'm always really shocked, and I don't know how much of that is just people traveling because Chicago's a big hub in the Midwest, but you know, Chicago isn't even like the greatest hub for live music. I've been surprised at some of the artists that have skipped over to Chicago in favor of Detroit or Cleveland and Columbus and Ohio for shows. Just because it's harder to book a show in Chicago, and you can still get people out in those areas. But yeah, you know, I see a lot of faces that I don't see at the goth identifying club nights, which is always really surprising to me.
Well, I think in general, I remember when I first started getting back into the Chicago scene, I think was like 4 or 5 years ago. Someone told me specifically because I was asking about, you know, who shows up to what, how are the turnouts and stuff. They were saying that you'll see the older goths and the trad goths show up for concerts, but you won't ever see them at a club night. So
for sure.
Yeah. But for like everything, yeah.
Well, you know, one other point I would like to make is that this crop of modern synthy gothy bands, I again, that's another thing, is there's not really a term for it because it's so disparate in terms of sound. But I would say they're also maybe a little more queer friendly than a lot of the 90s and 2000s acts, which were really kind of focused on male aggression in terms of the bands that got like really, really popular. Not always the case. I don't mean
probably
to,
more on the industrial side of things, I would think.
Yeah, of course, like in terms of like the goth, of course, not as much. But I would say you didn't hear the goth, like the actual goth music at clubs as much. Like when I turned 18 and started going out, it wasn't the same as it was now. You heard mostly industrial. Like you heard basically like Cyclone 9 screaming for half the night, and then you just waited until you could hear Sisters of Mercy. Whereas now, you know, I have heard Sisters of Mercy out so many times that I have to be drunk enough to dance to it and not and not make a face, which isn't to knock that. You know, I know just as many people who are fine never hearing Bizarre Love Triangle again for the rest of their lives. And again, I feel like that partially might be a Chicago thing, and just in terms of being like a touring musical hub as well. And we have a lot of great acts ourselves in these genres. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Wingtips.
But in terms of,
I love Wingtips.
Yeah. Oh yeah, like Wingtips, my friends in Pixel Grip, Hyde, Panic Priest and My Gold Mask,
Silent Age.
Oh, Shadow. Oh god, yeah, I meant to say Silent Age earlier. They're gonna kill me. That's edit that. Please edit that out. We'll talk later.
I'll think about it.
And I I will say it's also like I do that with so many different bands.
It's understandable. I mean,
but that was pretty
happens.
bad. I've done that before actually, and my Vinny, who is in Wingtips and also Silent Age, got a little annoyed at me but then they played a show together, which is not my fault if they're gonna play shows together.
Yes,
similar names. I was thinking about changing my band name, and I thought of one that what was it? It was I'm not gonna think about it off the top of my head, but there was a recent DIY venue called Resistor that shut down, and whatever name I had in mind also ended in like kind of like that, like taking like a verb, I guess, and just adding like at the end,
right? Sure.
And then I was like, oh, that's it. Even if like they didn't sound alike at all, that was still too close in my mind. I think it's really hard to come up with an original band name.
Oh
or
yeah,
club
definitely.
name now. There's a drag queen named Nocturna. I don't know if I've ever talked to Sarah about that. I might have brought it up. I feel like Sarah should probably just book that Nocturna. I know I don't know what city she performs in, but I think it's Midwest. But yeah, just in general, in terms of, I don't want to get away from this point. It's really important to me in terms of this modern crop of darker bands being more queer friendly. I view a lot of 80s goth as very queer, and I feel like a lot of the bands that cropped up in the 90s and 2000s kind of got away from that a little bit, whereas now, like Dry Majesty, for example, I don't believe he as a musician, as the person himself, identifies as queer, but when he performs, he talks as Deb, which is a genderless cosmic force, named after like his grandmother, I believe, or influenced by his grandmother. And there are so many acts, Mr. Kitty, who is super goth friendly. He's just as popular with like the Witch House fans as he sees with like synthpop fans. I would say my genre, like I identify a lot of this music even just as like synthpop, just to simplify things a lot of the time. Trust is queer. I don't know if he's ever just come out and said it, but he's from following him on social media, I would be comfortable calling him queer. There's just so much room for queer artists, and I feel I recently got into Lizette. She is I'm so again, I have to correct myself when I mess up. They are a gender non-binary artist from Sweden. That's another distinction. There's a lot of goth from like Sweden that people don't pay attention to, just 'cause that stuff gets more attention on like the blog circuit than it does maybe like the indie music blog circuit than it does the goth blogs or goth Tumblr posts.
Well, I mean, Americans kind of have an affair with the UK and with Germany, and then you've got bands from Italy and France and Sweden and all these other countries that nobody ever hears about over here, but they're pretty familiar in other circles.
But sometimes they do. It's just the weird part to me. Like, think of like maybe it's just because at the time that they really maybe released their most popular material, but like the Frozen Autumns from Italy, and I'm surprised that I still see.
Did
that.
you see them in Chicago?
I did not. What was? I want to say there was
good.
another concert that night that I heard. It might have been like Dry Majesty even. There was something else happening when they were in Chicago.
Mark drove up here to see them, and we both went, and it was amazing.
I'm happy to hear it was amazing, because that's the kind of I would say that's music that to me I would call it slightly cheesy, but I still love. You know, like
you gotta have a little bit of cheesiness.
But there's not like aggression, like male aggression in that music that makes me uncomfortable. There's like emotion and vulnerability that I am personally attracted to, and that's not to say there isn't a space for male aggression in music, but like Bono, just made comments saying,
"Oh my god, I saw that.
That was horrible." So, not to get off track, but it's just I feel like it's important to have a diverse amount. Oh, here's another example, and just in terms of like diverse voices, look at like Light Asylum, you have like a queer black woman, and that song, that's a song I would say is like a modern goth club classic. Like I hear that, like,
we play it at
all
our
the
club
time still, and people go nuts for dark. What's the name of the the big song. It's my brain sucks.
There's a couple of them. Dark Alleys.
Dark
Alleys.
Yeah, I was gonna say dark entries, and I was like, wait. No. So that's that's what I was talking about earlier about my brain conflating.
God, I love that fucking song though.
That's a great song. You just, you don't like. I know so many goths who idolize Grace Jones, but and I feel like talking about maybe discrimination and racism within the goth community obviously is its own subject, but I just think it's really important to keep in mind that when you think of like big genre identifying acts, it's mostly like white men, and I would love to be proven wrong there. Like if I'm misspeaking there, please let me know. But when I think of bands like on the more indie side of things, I see a lot more diversity personally.
Yeah, well, I mean that's why I think part of why I think the going back to the beginning, the kind of post-punk revival thing was important, because a lot of the 80s stuff came out of England, and it was all white dudes. All skinny white dudes, which, maybe that's a product of their time, but the stuff coming out now, I think, is really important to get those voices out there, to get representation for people who are goth or identify as whatever and are really into this kind of thing, but don't see themselves represented in the scene.
Oh, for sure. And I love that you said that. Like you just put that really eloquently. I think it's so important to see yourself represented and the media you consume in your scene. And for a lot of minorities, that doesn't happen a lot. I'm assuming you have touched on this in podcasts previously, but obviously there is a big emphasis in goth culture on being as pale as possible, which I'm just as guilty of that as anyone, but I think it's just as important to prop up the opposite as well. So I just think that's what's gonna keep the scene alive, and just keep goth as a community alive, is diversity personally.
Yeah, my thing is, what I've said before is that, I list off like all the influencers of the goth scene in the UK, but my thing is that goth is more about looking dead than about looking white. But not
everyone makes that same distinction,
right? Yeah. Right. And I think that's part of, another total other topic is how much mainstream cultural norms influence the goth scene. And I think that stuff kind of leaks in, like with the patriarchal norms and the expectations of like white culture leaking into what happens within goth. And I think that stuff kind of gets misinterpreted sometimes, but it's important to talk about that stuff and to get it. But that's a whole other show. Maybe we'll. Of course,
I know that could be like a whole podcast
another episode
in and of itself, obviously. But I do think that's another when we're talking about the kind of current intersection of goth with indie and pop. We focused a lot on the indie music, but I think another interesting area to look at is pop music. One thing that I've kind of had in mind leading up to participating tonight was, Taylor Swift recently kind of tried to turn her image around. And she got called goth a lot. I actually brought this up to a friend when I was hanging out with her later tonight. And it's really interesting that her just looking like she had like a zombie moment in her latest video, and maybe she wore black a lot in it. And she wasn't called emo, which was fascinating to me, and that's why I was kind of saying earlier. Goth. I feel like that they just went to goth when I felt like what she was doing, it wasn't emo or scene either, but it was closer to that maybe, and just in terms of aggression than what I would consider goth. It was just the fact that she was kind of rebelling at all. She got labeled goth, from a variety of media sources, even though nothing in that music video was truly goth. And then, she kind of put out like a cyberpunk video after, and just a lot of, kind of like buzzy new media articles on Taylor Swift is goth now, which is ridiculous. Or another good example I feel of this is there's a recent British band, Pale Waves. They are proteges of the 1975, who were like the number one pop band in the UK. They make like kind of smart synth poppy 80s pop, but it's very pop. And I know I sent their video Pale Waves to a friend, and he responds and he goes, "Oh, she looks so hot, but I wish their music was different," or something like that. And she looks like the singer looks like a Tim Burton character, but their music is just jangly, synthy guitar pop, which is hilarious. They just played Beat Kitchen here, and my friend went, yeah, he's big into jangle pop, and they kind of, I think, could pull maybe a few different audiences into their sound. They're not goth at all. Like, they maybe have slight post-punk influences, but slight post-punk, slight jangle pop influences, but for the most part, they're just like pop. I don't know what else to call it, but their music is like 60-70% synths, and then they don't have a synth player live. It was only guitars and drums and bass guitar. There wasn't a single synth on stage, and they actually just announced a new show in Chicago. I got an ad for it on my feed, and it described them as a synth pop quartet for a band that doesn't even have any live synths going on. I thought that was hysterical. But so yeah, there's also an intersection, I feel like, where pop music, just even separate from indie music, likes to flirt with goth imagery as well, cyclically. I would call that, Bring Me to Life by Evanescence. That was played on, probably played on the local like P96, which, if you're not from Chicago, is like the R&B station. I would be shocked if that never had gotten played once on B96. Like, that was, or even like Avril, like, that stuff, did get conflated with goth at the time. And I do feel like now because it's easier to find information on these subjects on the internet, maybe that's why that confusion doesn't happen quite as often. I feel like now when it happens, it's based off of image rather than musicality.
Yeah. Like black.
That was my point. It took me a long time to get there, but I got there. I was trying to say that it's not based on images. I mean, it is based on. Oh, I just misspoke now. It is based on image, I think, rather than the music. Whereas before, people would conflate like Marilyn Manson with goth.
Yeah.
There was a lot of crossover in between the fan base, but I wouldn't, consider his most of his music goth. I know he had like one post-punky slightly album when I was 19, which is creepy in retrospect. That whole
Golden
album.
Age of Grotesque. I don't know.
That was the one when he was dating Evan Rachel Wood, and she played like when she was like 19, and she was like a Lolita figure in all of his videos, and then they broke up. And he's another dude who needs to be called out. Like, after he broke up with Evan Rachel Wood, he like murdered her in a video, like with like a lookalike. It was horrible. It was horrifying. But that's what I'm saying. I feel like we're getting beyond that now, which is really inspiring to me.
Except for like the mainstream. Like, I think that's still very much based on image, not just like the runway, but with artists and stuff. And it's difficult for me to keep up with that kind of thing. Like, I get Google alerts.
Well, you're probably like what modern, besides this like for lack of a better word, hipster, like what are you listening to right now that you would identify as goth that isn't part of what we're talking about? That's modern. That's like new.
Yeah. So new musicians I'm listening to are like, Drab Majesty, of course.
But I'm saying stuff beyond what maybe somebody who is like super against goth and indie and pop music being grouped together.
Right. So
what are you listening to that's just like deathrock or gothic rock?
So Totenwald is one of my favorite bands right now. They're it's a female singer. They just added a saxophone player. They're basically death rock, and they're from Germany.
They look awesome.
Really
I'm
fucking
them
good
up right now.
Annex is a band from Texas. I'm really into female fronted, kind of post punk, more like kind of punk aggressive kind of thing. Supernova 1006. Have you heard of them?
I have not.
They're really fucking good. They're more on that spectrum of pop, synth pop, indie, like
Is it
edge kind of
Supernova 1006?
It's 1006, yeah. So 1006.
Oh, okay. I thought it was.
Yeah, not
10,
like
and then
extra.
1006. I see what you're saying right now.
Night Sins was another really good one. I think that was 2016, but
that was a good
this
album.
video, like I'm just like scrolling through their video for Dope. They look like a band just based off of the imagery I'm seeing that I would conflate with maybe the more kind of an image-based or expressive side of kind of some of this. I haven't heard the song, obviously, because I am on the podcast right now, but just image-wise, like, this doesn't look far removed from, I know, like, I'm in love with Void Vision, and her recent video for The Source just came on the side. Like, I feel like that's my thing. I just don't feel like there is a lot of just, like, gothy, for lack of a better phrase, gothy goth. Right. Yeah, like in 2017, I feel like
so there
it's
are
really spread out.
I'm trying to like Rotten UK is a really like hardcore death rock band.
And I feel like death rock's always been its own thing too, though, you know?
I mean, I'm not listening to those bands right now, to be honest.
I don't either.
Who is, though? That's my thing. Like, is anyone?
Yeah, Mark, what newer artists are you listening to?
I'm just leaning toward more like synthy stuff and like a lot of cold wave and synth pop and
what modern cold wave bands are you listening to? Because there's definitely, like, I would say there is a modern cold wave and minimal wave revival that kind of started
French
in New York
too.
With weird records.
I'm not familiar with
maybe
them,
like
so
Paradox Obscure.
See, but that's another one I would group in with what we're talking about. Like, Paradox Obscure is really... I love Paradox Obscure, by the way. I am a big fan of Crystal Ann.
Yeah.
I just heard the new Ghost, and her song on the last Ghost album was my absolute favorite. That's one of my favorite, like, kind of darker, gothy synth pop songs in a really long time. And they're just, like, the new Ghost song is just like metal. That's, it's also interesting looking at, like, that's what I'm talking about, though. I just feel like in terms of, like, self-identifying goth bands that sound like 90s and 2000s cold wave, like, there isn't a lot that sounds like, say, Cruise Shadows or the other bands that sounded like Cruise Shadows. Names I can't remember. There's one I was a bigger fan of than Cruise Shadows, whose name I can't. It's gonna come to me in like a minute, and I'm gonna like cry. Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. A lot of the bands both of you are throwing out, and I'm asking you, I could just as easily lump in with like Boy Harsher.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah. Mark, what's the album we're reviewing for next month? Because there's a whole New York label that has a bunch of these really weird, some cold wave, but a lot of really weird experimental goth electronic artists. And I think that band is on that label, and I can't remember.
Yeah, let me.
What the hell it was? I'm trying to pull it up.
Oh,
no, that's off me.
Oh, The Last Dance. The Last Dance was who I wanted to bring up earlier.
Oh, yeah.
Because I feel like that's aged better, but I still find it cheesy. It's this weird mix
really
of, like...
cheesy, yeah.
It's really cheesy, but I still would rather listen to that album than the Cruise Shadows if I was forced to pick at gunpoint.
Savage Exile is who I was thinking of. Oh, no. Azure Swan.
Yeah, Azure
that's
Swan.
The name of
Azure Swan's awesome. That's another, like, Azure Swan came out of that scene. I want to say Azure Swan's partner, I'm not sure if they're still together, but musical partner was part of Blacklist, who were one of the first big, like, cold wave identifying post-punk acts, like when I was in high school. I was on Blacklist, basically Weird Records came out of I want to say just Blacklist playing shows. I could be. I don't want to go into the history there because I'm not informed. I was just a fan of the music at the time.
Right.
I wasn't. Unfortunately, I was not 21 in New York. I would have loved it at the time.
God, yeah.
But Weird Records is really, I feel like, responsible for a lot of minimal synth and cold wave reissues and proliferating some of that music. Like they did like a Asylum Party cover. That was how I got into Asylum Party, honestly. And cold wave in general. And there was definitely like a cold wave based New York scene, like 2007 to 2009, 2010 for a while. It kind of dissipated when that record label broke. I don't know why either. It almost seemed like a really intellectual, like, we're just going to disband this now while it's still in the height. I feel like it probably could have even gone farther than it did. But yeah, Blacklist was like a really great, dreamy, kind of, I would say, very Chameleons-esque. That was definitely
They had one song that sounded just like The Cult. I forgot what it was called.
Blacklist? Yeah, for sure. Was it Julia Speaks, possibly?
I can't remember. It's been like 10 years since I've listened to them.
Well, yeah, they were interesting because they were kind of hipster goth identifying post-punk indie whatever, that's kind of my main point with all of this. I feel like getting hung up on something being too pop or being too anything. I would even say something being too goth, like it's just silly. Like just let the musicians make the music they want to make and present the image they want to present. And I feel like that there's also at the same time nothing wrong with identifying with a scene. I like scenes. I've identified as goth for a very long time. But what's kept me identifying as goth are bands that even if they don't identify as such themselves, or they might even identify as goth and not present their image as goth, but make really dark, fascinating post-punk. If they still have that vibe to them, it keeps me interested, and it keeps me like fascinated just with goth culture in general.
Yeah. One of the papers I read leading up to this was talking about how there's like the generic classifications, which they argued were inevitably drawn to because we have to have some sort of adjective or descriptor for to find new sounds and to understand like what's happening apart from the kind of effective emotional response we get from the music. And they argued that there's no real anti-generic music except maybe temporarily, where you have an explosion of kind of the blending and melting pot of a bunch of different stuff. But as time moves on, eventually we find descriptors for these things so that we can categorize and have a discourse and an understanding of like what we're into. But I think the most, and while I think I agree with that, I think really the interesting stuff is happening when you do have that explosion of what the fuck is this? I don't know, but it sounds cool kind of thing.
Yeah. I agree.
And I don't think either one are right or wrong, but it's nice to have that going from one to the other because both have benefits to understanding and expressing yourself and knowing what you're into, and also just to having your mind blown kind of thing. So I think that's important. Both of those are important.
I think genre descriptions and scenes kind of help you find other things you like personally. Like if you're like me, where you kind of like are like a sponge and you just like taking in as much new music as possible. I feel like comparisons as well as genres kind of help you discover other new things. But if on the flip side of that, if you're not into finding new things, then I can see why it would feel limiting.
Sure. Yeah. All right, I think we're going to close it there. Cool. It's been long enough. Josh,
I could probably go on for another hour and a half.
Joshua, if you can, once again, let us know where we can find you online before we go. Oh,
for sure. So, again, band name is Godfather Tot, which is Godfather Death, but don't Google search Godfather Death. Google search Godfather Tot Chicago and or music. I have a Bandcamp and SoundCloud. That's GEVATTERTOD. I don't think I said this earlier, but it's from a Grimm's Brothers fairy tale. I'm really into folk tales and kind of parables as kind of passing down history, especially in European countries. Anyway, also, if you would like to hear me spin music live, I am one of the DJs for Goth Disco, along with members of Pixel Grip and Wingtips, local genre bands. We DJ at Lape Arts, a queer night, every second Wednesday. And I also occasionally will do synthwave and just kind of like electro pop nights at Berlin Nightclub, just randomly.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much for taking time to hang out with us for a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for letting me blab for so long.
Thanks again, Joshua, for coming on. That was a lot of fun. If you're looking for more reading material on this subject specifically, I highly recommend the paper Gothic Music and the Inevitability of Genre. I'll have a link to that in the show notes, but it talks about and covers a lot of the things that we have touched on here in regards to genre classification. It talks about how you move from the first order effective emotional experience of listening to music, up to the third order adjectival categorization, where you sort of delimit genre, and you start to have this meta discourse about how you define what is this sound and what is that sound. It talks about the more metonymic lists that goths make, where you'll have a what's goth. I'm not going to talk about what it sounds like. I'm going to give you a list of bands, and that is sort of what delineates the genre of goth. It talks about the sort of canonization of goth and how that has an impact. It also talks about more of the mechanistic and mathematical ways that we understand music. I think Isabella Van Elfren's book goes into that in much more detail, which is Gothic music, the sounds of the uncanny. But I didn't necessarily want to talk about that on this episode, not just because I'm not a musicologist and it's certainly not my area of expertise, but there's only so much I could say about like what syncopated bass lines, minor keys, chromatically descending guitar riffs, and that kind of thing before it starts to get boring or it doesn't make any sense because I don't know what I'm talking about. But if you're interested in more information about this topic and how sound sort of evolves over time, and specifically in regards to goth music, I will have some sources for you in the show notes. That's it for the show. I hope you guys are enjoying this new format. We're going to be back again in 2 weeks, which is crazy. I hope you are enjoying the more consistent and getting material sooner than you would have last year. If you have strong feelings about this format one way or the other, please feel free to reach out. You can email us cemeteryconfessions@gmail.com. Always looking for feedback. And very specifically, we listed off the names of our Patreon members last week, but I would like to say thank you very much to everyone who is supporting us on Patreon. That is what has allowed us to do live streams, to post episodes early, to do this new format where we're splitting the show up and giving you really probably more content because the shows are getting longer. You can check that out at patreon.com/cemeteryconfessions if you would like to support us and see what kind of rewards you can get for doing so. Thank you for sticking around. We will be back in a couple weeks. So until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.
That's one. That's another. Plus advantage I would get to Chicago. Genre nights. They do a pretty great mix. Oh, and that's another. I didn't give this plug earlier. I'll have to do it at the end of the show. You might have to edit this part out. I was going to mention Goth Disco. I should have done that earlier. Yeah, but I can do that. Remind me to do that for my outro if you don't mind editing this little interjection out, because I totally feel bad that I forgot now. But yeah,
I'll try. I've been drinking whiskey, so I'll try to remember.
I am drinking Peppermint Twist Limited Edition Smirnoff, and it is amazing. And now I'm really bummed that this was probably just like the last stock from around Christmas, because it's actually really amazing. I'm drinking it with Diet Root Beer, which I used to always throw pre-Nocturna parties. I don't know if I should say Nocturna by name, just and assume people on the podcast listeners would know that it's like the big Chicago goth night.
We talked about it before.
When I was underage, I would always throw like pre-parties where everyone was underage. Partially. It was either everyone was underage or was like in their mid-20s, and would basically I liked Diet Root Beer and like vanilla vodka. That was my drink.
That sounds
I know
awful.
A lot of people don't like vodka. I feel like I'm the only person in the world who's
I do. That's my drink of choice.
Yeah, but not vanilla vodka.
Well, this was right when it wasn't just vanilla vodka. It gets worse. It was like toasted marshmallow vodka. That's right. I totally forgot. That was like the thing at the time. It was like kind of boutique like vodka flavors were a novelty, so everyone was like into trying it. And it just tastes like if like marshmallow and root beer just tastes like It goes together, but I have been described as having the alcohol taste of a college sorority sister.